All right. Well, first of all, hello and welcome. My name is Kat Train, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this next lecture on the schedule, which is titled Teaching Through Touch, which is presented by Lisa Florishak. Born and raised in New York, Lisa earned her degrees from SUNY New Paltz and Manhattanville College and has spent most of her time teaching in Connecticut. More recently, Lisa is in an instructor position at Arkansas State University. Her CV boasts exhibitions, symposiums, and residencies around the U.S., Europe, Australia, and Korea. Today, Lisa is presenting on her ongoing and fascinating research on the connection of understanding and learning through kinesthetic exploration using clay. I know, right? Sounds fascinating. But you're doing it right now. You're already exploring kinesthetically. Using clay as the straightforward and easily accessible manipulation tool. So once again, it is my sincere and utmost pleasure to introduce to you all my dear friend and sister in silica, Lisa Florishak.
Thank you. Well, hello everybody. You all have something in your hands, and I'm going to invite you to just have it in your hands and do whatever you need to do to experience that wonderful piece of clay. So about, I think it was maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, I experienced something in my teaching career that kind of rocked my world. I had a few students that were on the autism spectrum that were nonverbal and really not willing to deal with any other art material other than clay, if I could get them to even interact with the clay at all. And part of that, as I was told at that time, was the oversensory perception, the overstimulation. Couldn't deal with the information that was coming from their hands to their minds, and so therefore they reacted by pulling away, unless the clay was in leather hard stage, and then you couldn't get them away from it. I was really fascinated by that. There was something going on that I knew was just that's just the way it being said to me, that was just the way it is. However, I knew that there was more to it. Let's see. You might look at these two wonderful creatures. Actually, I'm thinking that most of you are looking at the texture of their wool, and or I should say, most of you that can see my presentation with these sheep, the texture of the wool, and you are probably thinking, I know what that feels like, but I want to make that connection to make sure that I know what that feels like. How many people can identify with that? Yeah, see, look around you. Don't be afraid. Look around you. You'll see. And what does that have to do with learning, specifically learning about clay, or learning about what clay does for your learning? There's two things that I like to address there. We look at our very earliest experiences, and we all know where he wants to put those things that are in his hands, right? We experience touch both passively and actively, and in this case, he wants to have that ball that's in his hands go right into his mouth. So when you think about touch, a lot of times we are taught not to touch things, but that's specifically applying to just your hands, right? You think about the way your pant leg feels on your leg right now, and the way the air moves through the room, that's touch. You're learning through all of those experiences. Most of you, some of you that are hungry are thinking, wow, I really would like to have this sliding down my throat right now, but then there are some of you that are absolutely repulsed by that salty, snotty fish. And when you think about that, that too is experiencing touch. The thing that I've learned about this investigation is that a lot of times we dull that sense. Part of it is because we've been told for so long that, you know, you can look at things but don't touch. And even when you don't buy into that wholeheartedly, you do somewhat. It's a bit of conditioning. And yet, when we experience touch that we're joyful about and know what it's going to feel like, we still run into surprises. This kindergartner, for instance, has more underglaze on his hands than he does on his project. And while he's really excited about working on that project, he doesn't know where to go from here because of the way that it feels on his hands. So this is one of the things that goes right back to what I learned in the beginning about at the beginning of the lecture when I talked about the students that I had that had autism. I said they were always like really fastidious about what was on their hands and how they were experiencing their world around them. And you see it with all stages of learning, and it's fascinating. When we think about more food, I'm sorry, it's noon. You think about this bowl of grits, for instance. You might know exactly how it's going to taste, but believe it or not, the texture of the food, the color of the food, the way the glaze feels under that spoon, all of that activity is sending your brain signals, and it will make you decide whether you like something or don't like something, whether you need to explore it further or whether you need to push it away. But you make all of those decisions based on the way things feel. By the way, did you know that if I pureed this, it would not have the same taste as if it was all solid? And texture across your taste buds is a really, really big part of the information that you get about taste. So, and there's a lot of study on that. And think about this, you know, going back to that slide with the baby, when we think about what would it be like if you were sitting in a dinner party and you had the futurists and you were one of the futurist group and you were asked to wear a pair of silk pajamas that might have sandpaper attached to it or some kind of different textured materials, and you have these multi-sensory planes that you're having to deal with. And how do you process that? And this is all part of that exploration of learning. How can you affect somebody's learning or understand somebody's learning? Because if you understand how they learn, you're more effective as an educator or a facilitator of somebody. You're of a group of people that are trying to learn about a material such as clay. When you look at this particular skater, by the way, he is learning information about through the ice. He's barefoot in those skates. I know that because this is my son, actually. And he's barefoot because skaters will often skate barefoot so that they can feel the ice. So he knows what's going on underneath his feet. He knows how much pressure he has to apply. He knows how that pressure and that lean into the ice is going to affect his momentum. He's very different from this skater, who is the same kid, by the way. And you can see his angle is very, very different. And he's trying to learn that pressure through his foot to figure out where he needs to put that pressure to move forward. When I started putting all this stuff together, it really made me think about the kids that I'm teaching. And I've taught all grades from preschool up to my current position, which is college. And one of the things I learned, one of the greatest things that I've learned, is that I have to step back often, because the things that I think that I know, I don't know at all. So we have the need to understand how they apply their pressure to get to the finished product. So in the case of a pinch pot, you might have students that can pinch readily and get that pot perfect, but you might have students that actually have to approach it a different way to get to that same outcome. And some of it involves applying pressure, and then some of it involves applying pressure in a subtractive manner, like to get to that same end. We know that proprioception, when we look at how a student approaches the wheel, if we look at the study of sports, for instance, proprioception, or where your body is in space, is rote. But we have to do that on the wheel as well to get any results. What I've found in my teaching is that sometimes you need to actually encourage and then let them fail a couple of times. I mean, a lot of you will probably say that, right? Or a lot of you have experienced that, where you've been encouraged and have failed at throwing. Raise your hands if throwing is a difficulty or was a difficulty. See? Look around the room. All right. So one of the things I learned about proprioception is that it's relevant and it is specific, just like sports are. If practicing a sport, you have to be relevant and specific to the actual action that you're trying to complete. What I learned when coaching sports is that I absolutely could not get a blindfolded skater to do anything that was relevant to his practice as a sighted skater. It just doesn't match up. So I started taking that information and working with students when I taught the wheel. It's basically trying to get them to tune out to the point where you're manipulating material. Your mind already knows your mind has already made that connection to your hands. Your hands already know that choreography. It's that processing time that needs to work in. And when you blindfold somebody, it's not, if they're sighted, it's not relevant to their experience, and it's not something that they're going to do on a regular basis. So they probably they might have a little bit of success of knowing what it might feel like to not be able to see what they're doing. But I don't know, I still kind of back away from that process a little bit. I think that it becomes this thing that can be good or bad, and so I tend to go with let's see if they can figure out what they're feeling with their whatever modalities they have. Sorry. When we get to a process that is not on the wheel, hand building, it is the same idea, only you're pulling back a little bit and slowing down your process to the point where you reframe it in a different manner. You don't have centrifugal force working with you at the same time, and so therefore you're able to think it out a little bit better. So this is one of my students. This is Nikki. And this is how I came to this complete evolution of understanding that everything I knew, I had to re-ask myself. Nikki was with me for 2 semesters. I teach at a small community college, so part of the Arkansas State University system. And she was graduating the year that she came to see me. And we got through the fall semester. 3 weeks, it was Thanksgiving break, I learned that she was vision impaired. So she was one of those kids that would throw water on her pots all the time. And I used to think, why are you doing that? And I used to try to get really in touch with why she was doing that, because I couldn't get her to stop doing it. And so she told me when I signed her a research project that she was blind. She's like, you need to put this in a different format for me. And I had never considered that. And that's where I started to realize that sometimes your students, I mean, I've realized that over and over again, but I realized it again. Sometimes students or people you're interacting with have a different way of processing the material they're working with, and they're processing in the way that they need to process it. So you need to step back and assess the situation and allow that process to happen. And it's hard to do at times, but she taught me everything that I knew about clay or about sensory perception was true. She also taught me a few things that just blew my mind. So what she's doing here is she's one of those students that has to work in a subtractive manner. She needs her work to be smooth. All of her work will go through this process of being smoothed out to the point where she can tell what it is she's handling. She explained to me that anything within her arm's reach is about the scope of where she can interact with her world, because she doesn't understand if the stuff beyond that arm's reach is dangerous to her. She doesn't understand if it's going to be sharp. She can understand if it's hot, but she doesn't understand if she knocks something over, if it's going to break. So she has a very specific way of dealing with her world. And this is where I learned that those fastidious kids and that oversensory interaction was probably something that was a little bit different than what I had been explained. I learned that Nikki can't experience her world unless her hands are clean, because that's the way she experiences the things that are going on. That's the way she accesses her world, or her learning. And she said to me, did you ever think that maybe those students, they needed that same kind of interaction? And so that just blew my mind. She also told me about how when she works with clay, if she wants a texture in the clay, think about this. She has to put the texture in, then she can't feel the texture, then she has to fire it and hope that if she wants to repeat it, if she likes it, she has to go back and try to do it again, and she can't guarantee that what she did was exactly like what she started with. And it just, it's fascinating to me. So I thought I would talk about it. So here we have her looking at one of her pieces that is textured, and she's trying to decide. I don't think she liked that one. But if everything was a texture test, that's just, I can't imagine that. A situation like this would have killed her, in a sense, because this particular having your hands wet and muddy, throwing on the wheel was something that she wanted to desperately do, but she couldn't find the right amount of moisture content that would give her the information that she needed. She worked really wet on a banding wheel a lot of times, but when we tried to transfer that to the wheel, the slip really bothered her, so she kind of gave up.
So that was a textual thing?
It's a informational thing. The slip gets caught on her fingers, and it really basically mutes her understanding. With that said, where it's brought me. So I teach a art history class, and it's really made me understand experiential learning and how touch can actually help you process those things that you are accessing in your learning every day. These kids have no interest in art, absolutely no interest in art for the most part. I might have a class of 30 kids in art history, and I would say 10 of them are really excited about working with materials, and the other 20 are kind of, I just have to take this to graduate. So what I decided to do in this art history class was, it's an 8 o'clock in the morning class. and they are sitting in the dark looking at slides, and unfortunately, the curriculum requires me, the state actually set the curriculum, and the curriculum requires me to cover prehistory all the way up to the current in 16 weeks, which is mind-blowing. And so what I decided, that despite being told that there wasn't enough time to have them do art projects, that I just turned a blind eye to that and said, okay, well, they're going to do art projects. So we don't do projects per se, but when we're looking at things like the Venus of Willendorf, you think about that, right? You're looking at Venus sculptures, and you hand them a ball of clay, and you say, okay, make what you see on, what you've just looked at. And then 3 weeks later, you hand them a ball of Egyptian paste, or, some Egyptian paste, and you say, okay, make something that you just experienced in looking at Egyptian art. All of a sudden, even in that 15 minutes, touching material makes what they're learning completely relevant and completely exciting. I've had students decide that they want to take an art class just because they were able to relate to what they were looking at. Meanwhile, before they started, looking at art was completely a snooze. And then finally, I want to talk about how learning through that touch and learning how to access your education through touch really broadly spans the spectrum of what a student is experiencing. You don't know if they are experiencing extreme stress. You don't know if they're experiencing anxiety over not being able to complete a math problem. But allowing them, or a chemistry problem, or whatever, writing a paper, allowing them to access that sensory perception allows them to access that processing time. It allows them to slow down. And I wanted to end with Steve Bramfman's a slide of Steve Bramfman's work when he went through extreme stress and anxiety over the death of his son, because he told me that he's never felt closer to the clay, and the clay became this almost virile part of him. It was hard for him to explain what it meant and how he needed it, and how important the touch was, not just to get through the grief, but to get through that time of not knowing what to do with those emotions. And as a person that teaches students that are basically that age between high school and adult life, and not knowing what emotions they're going through, that statement was very powerful to me. You have kids and people in your world that need to access that processing time. If you think about play and touch or think about that sensory perception of touch as being able to be a meditative place, then I think that the learning that they access will be tremendous. So, there you go. That's about all I have.